Philip Queen here in Seattle, Washington. I wasn't able to be there live due to timing with time zones, but um, I'm pre-recording this, so unfortunately I can't answer questions. So hopefully I'll just cover as much as I can, and you can reach out to me later if you do have questions. Um, Today I'll be presenting about the SAIR report, Slackline Accident and Incident Reports from 2021. So the SAIR is the Slackline and Incident Reports. It's a survey managed by the ISA. It's used for data keeping, sharing common occurrences, and reporting major accidents. This talk is mostly going to be the sharing common occurrences thing. I'm going to be talking about the statistics gathered from the 2021 reports and um, hopefully be able to cover what the common things that happen are. Maybe we can stop history from repeating itself, or at least understand what our biggest risks are as we slackline. And all of this is going to be covered for the 68 reports that were sent in for 2021. One of the most common questions I get asked about the incident report is what counts as an incident. So questions like, well, no one actually got hurt. Is that still an accident? This happened at a highline, but wasn't highline related. And pretty much some metric or rubrics to think about that are anything you might tell your friends about at the anchor or at the park, anything like worthy of the story is probably an incident report. Also, if you're wondering if you should fill out a report, it's always better to just fill out the report. That way we can decide what's interesting and not miss out on any potentially important information. So we can always ignore or disregard a report if it's totally unrelated to slacklining in our eyes, but it's better for us to get the report and decide if it's relevant than just not get the information. And it's also worth mentioning there's a separate report for wind-related incidents, so things like line detaping, abrasion on anchors, and that's separate just because the wind report collects different information that's more geared towards the wind conditions at the time. So with all that being said, let's jump into looking at the statistics. So first we will look at the geography. This represents where all the incidents happened that were reported. So we see United States, France, Germany, Italy make up the majority of the reports. But we do have pretty good global coverage, including Australia, Israel, Africa, South America, Turkey. Yeah, pretty good full coverage, although we're seeing obviously a lot of United States and Europe. In terms of nationality of reporter, things don't change very much. Again, majority is American, French, German. There's a lot of overlap, but not 100% with where the accident happened. Moving on to the types of slackline involved, where we're going to get a little more interesting. We can see at the start, the vast majority of these are highline related. This was not the case a few years ago. I believe 2018 was the last time statistics were done on the report like this, and that showed fairly similar longline and highline accidents. And now we're seeing mostly highline related. And I think the main takeaway from that is that the most dangerous form of slacklining is whatever the most people are doing. So the more highliners we have, the more highline accidents we have, the more longliners we have, the more longline accidents we have. But it shifted pretty far in the highline direction because now even basic low park lines are seeing more accidents than long lines. Also a little surprising to see as many waterline accidents as we are. Next, we have the actual accident types. In this case, leash injuries and highline injuries were separated, and there's a few other categories that could be lumped into highline injuries. So overall, we're definitely seeing injuries related to highlining are the most common type of accident that's being reported. Gear failures are the second most common. That's not necessarily gear breaking due to manufacturing issues. It's in part due to misuses with with pieces of gear. So it kind of lumps a few of those together. We see a fair number of park line injuries. Rigging errors are quite common. Wind is a very common thing reported. We have both wind failures and wind incidents. All of these, just another plug for the separate wind report. It gathers a little more useful information about the wind. We see quite a high number of forgotten leashes for the severity of that. I'll discuss that a little more later. The failure of anchor category represents anchor points failing, so not the slackline gear, but whatever the slackline gear is attached to for the anchor. We're seeing issues with soft releases, injuries from the webbing directly, and occasionally in pretty minor instances, injury during access, rope swinging, or trick lining. So dialing in on injuries for a little bit, about 2/3 of the reports documented injuries. So we're seeing generally people are filling out ISA reports due to injuries. And about 10% of these injuries required a rescue. So that represents 7 reports. 5 of those were rescues by highliners, so where the people at the anchor go get the person injured out on the line back to safe ground, and then 2 of those were by emergency services, which weren't necessarily from the highline, but maybe required emergency services to get someone back to medical attention from the anchor. So in terms of types of injuries reported, fractures and cuts and sprains are the most common. We also see a fair number of dislocations and concussions. And then some amount of spinal injuries, other internal injuries, and we did have 1 death reported this year, which I'll also talk more about later. So overall, it's those fractures, broken bones, or cuts, sprains that are most common. So relatively surface stuff. By the location on the body, we see a pretty interesting trend of a lot of finger and hand injuries, 12 overall to the fingers and hands. These are things like broken fingers, there's 1 finger amputation, burnt hands during rigging, 1 broken wrist. We also have a high number of face injuries, 3 of which were eye injuries due to the leash, which is a pretty strong trend for the year of leash injuries, particularly to the eye. It's a lot. There are also other face injuries due to predominantly the leash. There's 1 caught piercing on the face, which is just a good reminder to either remove or protect face piercings. Otherwise, it's mostly as expected, a pretty even distribution between back, arm, the feet. Not very many knee injuries reported, which is probably means people aren't reporting things like ACL, MCL tears or knee sprains or just general knee pain as much as they're reporting more acute injuries, um, like a removed finger. Still a number of head, leg, elbow, and then we did have a couple groin injuries, both men, in case you're curious, both due to whippers. Nothing, nothing horribly serious though. Um, in terms of severity, we broke it down in terms of minor, moderate, and major. Minor would be something that's like, oh yeah, I hurt myself, but it went away pretty quickly. Moderate would be, something bad enough to stick around. So like a broken bone or something that will just put you out of action for weeks to months at a time. And then major would be like a pretty gnarly, nasty injury, like a major concussion, some of the worst eye injuries. Yeah, anything, spinal cord injuries, anything like that goes in the major category. So most of the injuries were minor or moderate, but still quite a strong amount of major injuries that we saw. And again, there's also probably some reporting bias where it's much less likely someone reports a minor injury than a moderate or major, just because they might not think it's worth reporting. Um, but that's one reason I advocate everyone to just go ahead and report so that we can get more representative statistics for this type of thing. Um, as far as the slackline experience of the injured person, and this is reported by whoever filled out the report. So in some cases, that is the injured person and it's self reported, and in some cases, it's someone else, maybe the person who did the rescue or a bystander. Um, we're seeing a big skew towards intermediate and expert slackliners. So beginner slackliners are getting hurt, but certainly experience is not preventing injury. Some of this is again reporting bias where beginner slackliners might not be aware of the ISA. There might be many more basic slackline injuries of people falling off and hurting a wrist or a finger or a leg. But in terms of the people who the ISA is reaching and are motivated enough to fill out an ISA report, we're seeing a lot of intermediate and expert slackliners hurting themselves. So it's just a good reminder to everyone out there that your experience level does not protect you from these type of accidents. They can happen to anyone. So it's always best to stay vigilant and keep making your risk assessments with that in mind. We also have the reported slackline experience of the person who filled out the ISA report. So this is always by necessity self-reporting. Here we can see that very few beginner slackliners are filling out the SAIR report. Is mostly intermediate and expert slackliners, which just shows who this form is reaching. The reporter doesn't tell us too much about the incident, but it does tell us about who's reporting and what slice of the slackline world that we're getting with this report. We also have the rigging experience, so beginner riggers are slightly more likely to report, but mostly the same trend of we're reaching intermediate and expert people in terms of filling out the form, Sometimes that's intermediate and expert people who witnessed something happen to a beginner, but pretty often that's going to be intermediate and expert people hanging out with each other. So people connected to the Slackline community and were missing beginners who were just getting involved. One interesting thing is that almost all people who filled out an ISA report were comfortable with us publishing the report. So it's worth noting to anyone out there who might be wondering about filling out an ISA report, we can fully, you have full control over whether we publish it, whether it's anonymous, anything like that. If you have special requests, there's room in the form to make those, and we can accommodate them. We'd rather have the data so we can get really good statistics than just not have a report, even if we can't publish it. Very few people, even within the ISA Safety Commission, are able to see the actual reports themselves. So, don't be afraid or ashamed to fill out the reports, because there is always the opportunity for you to say, no, please don't publish it. We also see that it's much more common for people to say, yes, you can publish it, but please keep it anonymous. So the majority would rather be anonymous. Well, there are a handful, or quite a number, who are okay with their names being attached to it. Some other notable figures from this year that I don't have pretty graphs to show is there was one fatality this year. It was due to a forgotten leash, and there is, I believe, an ISA publication about it, or at least a Facebook post, but I am pretty sure we published a document about it. It was due to a forgotten leash, but what I think is really interesting is there were 3 other forgotten leashes in this year's data. So that even after the prevalency of deaths due to forgotten leashes, we're still getting 4 in 2021. So of those reports, 2 were caught by other highliners, but 1 did include a non-lethal fall. So of the 4 reported, 2 were caught by buddy checks. 1 was not caught by a buddy check and led to death, and 1 person was lucky enough to be able to fall off a high line or midline and not die. Those non-lethal falls are really important because of all the controversy there has been around forgotten leash fatalities, particularly the theory that a lot of those are free solo attempts. We have a handful of reports of accidental forgotten leash, where the person did fall without knowing they were untied, fell to the ground, and survived. And no cases of that happening with an intentional solo. So all of the data we have does indicate that the forgotten leashes are a serious problem, not having anything to do with intentional free soloing, but just honest mistakes while tying in. So buddy checking, double checking yourself, being really vigilant around anchors, being good about not distracting people tying in. These sorts of things remain the biggest safety thing that you can do while highlining. Beyond that, there were also 3 backup falls in this year's data, or in 2021's data. This is really worth mentioning because so often you hear people either say there aren't backup falls or backup falls almost never happen. But we do have three from three different reasons represented in the 2021 data. One was due to a soft shackle on the main opening. This report was published publicly by the people it happened to on Slack chat. It was attributed to a large noose and the noose sitting on a sheath, so the button knot didn't stop the noose from opening as effectively because the noose was already wider due to the sheath. So being extremely careful with sheathed soft shackles and just in general making sure soft shackles are sitting in the proper way is important. One was a soft release failing. It was not tied off in any way. This is a really common thing I see on rigs, at least in America, is a soft release that maybe has a Velcro strap around it, but isn't actually tied off. But we have seen quite a few mainline failures just due to the soft release opening. So tying off the tail of your soft release is probably the single easiest thing you can do to avoid a backup fall. And so the data continues to report that, even though we've posted about soft releases failing a number of times before this incident happened. It still happens. We also have one mainline breaking. This was also reported publicly. This was an 80-meter dynamite line that broke during a unicycle fall. It was attributed to a bad tie-off, so as the webbing slipped, it was a very short, very static line, so it was liable to slip. As it slipped, the webbing was twisted in the web lock, and then that twist made a weak point for it to eventually break. So tying really good web lock tie-offs, making sure you go back through, around, and up the web lock when you do your tie-off so it sits flat as it loads the tie-off. And then also just understanding that forces are far higher on high-tech lines, especially when they're short. So high-tech lines under roughly 200 meters should always have some stretch added to the system, typically through like a stretchy nylon extender or short segment, to keep leash forces, anchor forces at reasonable levels. We also have a high number of soft release issues reported in the data, beyond the soft release failing. A few of these are in the report. There's also a few that we're still waiting on reports to be filled out for. There were a lot of issues on lines anywhere from kilometer plus long lines down to 100-meter lines, of soft releases being too short. So that happens when you start releasing the soft release. You've removed enough wraps that it's starting to slip, but you have no more soft release to release. So you're holding tension still, and the soft release wants to open up, and you don't have any more slack to give. So this was very common. It led to one person being pulled off the cliff, thankfully caught by a PAS. It can also lead to a explosive release of the soft release, which could break tagline injure the rigger, all sorts of things. So, for example, personally, I had was de-rigging a 1K, and someone had put a 12-foot long soft release on it. We'd pulled out roughly 50 meters of slack from the system. So even noticing before releasing that the soft release was too short, fully tightening tagline, the 8mm tagline we were using, was too stretchy in a Z drag to hold tension by the time that 12-foot soft release was out, and it led to an explosive release. I did it and luckily was able to keep my fingers and hands out of it. But it was sketchy. And so one of the biggest things for soft releases is making sure your soft release is the appropriate length for the line. It has to be able to release however much slack you pulled out of the system while tensioning, more or less. It's also important to be very careful when removing the soft release. We had incidents where the soft release got twisted or tangled while it was being undone, and then was no longer able to release, and then that leaves the rigging issue of how do you remove tension. And so either forcing it with your hands near the high tension thing, or coming up with an ad hoc like rigging setup that might not be strong enough. These are the types of things we're seeing with soft releases. One interesting trend we had this year was much lower than expected incidence of freestyle highlining. Only 12% of the accident reports this year involved it. It was roughly 8 reports, and we had like 50 highline related. So even within highlining, we're seeing it's only around 20% were freestyle related. That seems surprisingly low, but it's also possible that since freestyle has been growing so quickly over the last couple of years, that it still hadn't been happening long enough to get too much going bad with it. Based on just accidents I'm aware of personally, in 2022, we're going to see this number go up. So particularly around highline injuries, leash injuries, things like that, I think we're going to see more freestyle related things. We were also only able to determine freestyle related based on if they were mentioned in the report. So it's possible that some of the other highline injuries were freestyle related. They just didn't say so in the report. So we assumed they were not. But certainly interesting that there were not as many as we had thought there might be. And will be interesting to see if that does in fact change this coming year. So I'd like to end with a call to just fill out the accident report. It doesn't have to be something new. It can be something that happened to you 5 or 10 years ago. It doesn't have to be something major like losing a finger. It can be anything that is a slackline story worth telling. A slackline accident or incident worth telling, not just your great successes. So anything that might be represented in this data, close calls are welcome. Things that happen at highlines that might be tangential to the highlines, like related to access. Was someone injured trying to get to a high line, trying to leave a high line, things of that nature. We would rather have the data than not have the data, and we can always change how it's reported. But the more I talk to people, the more I hang out at Highline festivals or with local crews, everyone has something that they could fill out this report for. We haven't been taking this data for too long. I think maybe we have reports dating back about 10 years from now. But I believe the form was started in 2015 or 2016. Maybe there was a precursor version to it then, but really we're at the base level of getting statistics about Highline incidents, the base level of really understanding from a quantitative perspective what the risks are, and there is also interest in this type of statistics from certain people who are looking for slackline and highline access. Land managers or responsible parties want to know how dangerous what we are doing is. If we only fill out accidents for the gnarliest, worst things, it will make it seem like slackline accidents are terrible, high liability. The more accident reports we have that are like, I hurt myself minorly, I self-rescued, I was okay in 2 weeks, everything's fine, then the percentages look better. And we also just can make better risk assessments within the community. The form is also available in English, German, French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. So for most people, there shouldn't be a good reason to not fill out the report. We're able to translate those reports, and if you or someone you know would like to fill out the report in a different language, reach out and I'm sure we can figure out some translation method, or you can fill out any of the other reports in another language and we'll do our best to translate it. So that's all I have today. I wish I were available to answer questions directly, but it seems like I've already went over time. So reach out. Again, my name is Philip Queen. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram. You can ask for more questions, and I'll do my best to respond and answer to those.